man you were convicted of killing just appeared alive.
What? That's impossible. They told me you were dead.
They were wrong.
Then who did they bury?
Reed, answer the question.
They didn't bury me. The body they found wasn't mine.
Order!
Then whose body was it?
That is exactly what they never wanted discovered.
Daniel, don't come here.
What happened?
Daniel Cross? Yes, you need to come with us. Why?
Michael Reed is dead.
What?
And you're the last person who called him.
Where is Michael? That can't be him.
You know him.
Of course I know him.
Then explain why your fingerprints are all over this room. Your phone was found beside the body.
I never touched him.
Your fingerprints.
Your phone, your car outside. Someone is setting me up. Then tell me who. Detective!
We found the murder weapon, this too.
No! Wait, that camera was recording. That's the wrong time. I wasn't even here when that footage says I was.
Someone changed the timestamp. You knew.
That's me. Someone deleted 11 minutes.
What happened during those 11 minutes?
The deletion was made from inside this building.
This building.
So somebody here erased the evidence.
Shut it down.
Daniel.
Then why was I arrested? That file existed before I was even a suspect. Move! You already knew.
This wasn't an investigation, it was a setup.
What was Michael investigating?
You shouldn't have opened that.
Who is he? Who was Michael investigating? This is the message that brought me here.
Who sent it?
Michael never sent this. They didn't want me to find Michael. They wanted me at the crime scene.
Daniel. Who is that? Kane isn't working alone.
You were never supposed to see this. 18 years earlier, Daniel Cross was just 24 years old, living a monstrous lie.
18 years earlier,
Every
there was
story
nothing
leaves something
remarkable
behind.
about Daniel Cross.
Subscribe to Mindfold Stories.
He worked with his
Your
hands,
next story may
paid his
change
bills,
everything.
looked after his mother, and still found time to argue with his younger sister about things neither of them would remember a week later. His life was modest, but it was his. There was a silver sedan in the driveway, a job he occasionally complained about, and a family that expected him home for dinner. Nobody looking at him that morning would have imagined a courtroom, a prison cell, or 18 years disappearing behind steel doors. He certainly couldn't have. The tragedy wasn't that his life was imperfect. It was that someone else was about to decide what his life would become. Across town, another man was having a very different evening. Michael Reed had spent years learning how to move through rooms where everyone appeared to know something he didn't. He was intelligent, ambitious, and increasingly uncomfortable with the people surrounding him. That night, he noticed a man watching him from across the restaurant. The stare lasted only a few seconds. Then the stranger looked away. It should have meant nothing. Instead, it became one of the last moments Michael would spend in public before disappearing. And somewhere between that restaurant and midnight, a decision was made that would eventually place an innocent man behind bars. The call came shortly after 11. A friend needed help. Nothing about the request sounded extraordinary, yet the urgency in the voice on the other end made him leave almost immediately. His mother asked where he was going. He promised he wouldn't be long. That promise would later become one of the details detectives used against him. Not because it proved anything. Because once suspicion takes hold, ordinary decisions begin to look sinister. A short drive became a timeline. A missed call became evidence. And a young man trying to help someone became, on paper, a man with something to hide. The address led him to a house on the edge of town. Its front door was open. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Then he noticed the shattered upstairs window. The rain had already begun washing footprints from the pavement, but the silence around the property was more disturbing than the broken glass. He called out. No answer. Another call went unanswered. By then, instinct was telling him to leave. Instead, he stepped inside. He didn't know that every second spent in that house was quietly building the case that would later destroy his life. The smell of smoke and rain followed him into the living room. Then he saw the body. Everything inside him seemed to stop. Michael Reed was lying motionless behind an overturned piece of furniture. Daniel knew him only by reputation. They had never been close. There was no reason for him to be there, and no explanation for why the dead man's final night had somehow intersected with his own. He reached for his phone. His hands were shaking. He called emergency services. That decision would later be presented as evidence of guilt. The person who made the call, they argued, wasn't a frightened witness. He was a murderer trying to control the scene. Police arrived within minutes. Daniel expected questions. What he didn't expect was the way Detective Robert Kane looked at him. There was no uncertainty in that expression. Only calculation. The scene was photographed. The house was sealed. Daniel's hands were examined. His phone was taken. His clothes were bagged as evidence. Then Kane asked a simple question. How did you know the victim? The answer was honest. He barely knew him. The detective wrote something down. Daniel noticed the question had changed. They were no longer trying to discover what happened. They were beginning to decide who had done it. The first physical clue appeared inside Daniel's car. A technician found a tiny fiber caught near the driver's door. It was dark. It was ordinary. And by itself, it meant almost nothing. But Kane treated it differently. The fiber was photographed, sealed, labeled, and carried away. Later, investigators would claim it matched material found inside the victim's house. What nobody told Daniel was that the comparison was never as conclusive as the courtroom would eventually make it sound. By sunrise, the investigation already had a direction, and Daniel was standing directly in it. By 4:37 in the morning, exhaustion had replaced fear. The questions kept circling back to the same places. Why had he gone there? Why had he called? Why couldn't anyone confirm exactly when he arrived? Daniel answered each one. Then Kane placed a photograph on the table. It showed Michael Reed. You were there, the detective said. Yes. You touched the scene. I called for help. You expect us to believe that? Daniel stared at him. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to find whoever did this. The recorder continued running. But the interrogation had already stopped being a search for answers. Then came the witness. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She had been driving through the neighborhood that night and remembered seeing a silver sedan near the house. The detail mattered, but her memory was uncertain. She couldn't identify the driver. She couldn't say when the vehicle arrived. She couldn't even be certain the person she saw was Daniel. Kane placed a photograph in front of her. Does this look like the man you saw? She hesitated. That hesitation should have ended the identification. Instead, it became the beginning of something far more dangerous. The detective asked again. This time the answer changed. At dawn, the police came to Daniel's home. His mother opened the door. The officers didn't ask permission to enter. They had a warrant. Murder. The word seemed absurd until the handcuffs closed around his wrists. His mother shouted that they had the wrong man. Daniel kept looking at her, trying to reassure her even while his own face betrayed what he was feeling. He had gone to a house because someone needed help. Now he was being placed inside a police car as a murder suspect. The door slammed, and as the vehicle pulled away, the investigation had officially become a prosecution. What Daniel didn't know was that the evidence against him was about to become overwhelming. Not because it was real, because someone had been preparing it long before the police arrived. The first night behind bars was quieter than he expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no warning that his life had just changed forever. Just a steel door closing between him and the woman who had raised him. Through the narrow glass, he watched his mother being led away. She kept turning around. He kept telling himself that this was temporary. The evidence would be examined. The mistake would be corrected. Someone would eventually notice what was wrong. That faith lasted longer than it should have. The case moved quickly. Too quickly. Detective Kane delivered a thick file to the district attorney's office, and every page seemed to point in the same direction. The car, the fiber, the witness, the unanswered questions from the interrogation. Individually, none of it was devastating. Together, it looked like a story. And stories are dangerous when investigators become convinced they already know the ending. The prosecutor studied the file for several minutes before asking one question. "Do we have a confession?" Kane answered no. She closed the folder. "Then get me one." Before the trial even began, the public had already been given a version of the story. A young man had entered a house. A man was found dead. Evidence had connected the two. The district attorney described the case as a deliberate and violent act. Those words spread faster than the truth ever could. By evening, Daniel's photograph was appearing on television screens across the city. People who had never met him were already discussing his motive. His mother turned off the television. She couldn't bear hearing strangers describe the son she knew as a monster. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, prosecutors were preparing to make that description permanent. Daniel was assigned a public defender named Marcus Cole. At the time, Cole was younger, less experienced, and carrying more cases than any one attorney should have been expected to handle. He believed Daniel was innocent. But belief wasn't enough. He needed something that could survive a courtroom. The problem was that every time he challenged one piece of evidence, another appeared. A witness, a laboratory report, a police timeline, a statement supposedly made during interrogation. The case had been assembled like a wall, and every brick seemed to support the one beside it. Then, while reviewing the evidence late one night, Cole noticed something that didn't belong. The timeline was supposed to be airtight. It wasn't. One report placed Daniel's car near the house at 11:18. Another recorded the emergency call at 11:31. That left barely 13 minutes between the alleged arrival and the call. Cole checked the distance, then checked it again. The journey itself could take almost that long. There was no reasonable way to fit everything investigators claimed had happened into the available time. He leaned back from the table. For the first time, the case didn't look overwhelming. It looked manufactured. But proving that in court would require more than a calculation. It would require someone willing to admit the original investigation was wrong. The fiber evidence looked impressive on paper. Under a microscope, however, certainty became harder to find. Dr. Alina Brooks, the forensic analyst assigned to the comparison, found similarities between the material from Daniel's car and material recovered at the house. Similarities, not an exact match. Her report used careful scientific language. The prosecution would later describe it much more confidently. That difference mattered. Because in a courtroom, a sentence can change meaning simply by removing 3 words. Consistent with became matched. Could have originated from became came from. and uncertainty slowly disappeared from the story. There was another option. A plea deal. If Daniel admitted to a lesser offense, prosecutors would recommend a reduced sentence. He would still lose years of his life, but he might eventually walk out. He refused, not because he misunderstood what prison meant, because accepting the deal would mean admitting to a murder he hadn't committed. The prosecutor left the document on the table. Daniel pushed it back. "I'd rather spend 20 years telling the truth than one day pretending I did it." That sentence would follow him for decades. So would the answer he received. Then prepare for trial. When the trial began, the prosecution didn't need to prove that Daniel was a terrible man. It only needed to make the jury believe there was no reasonable alternative. The evidence arrived one piece at a time. The car, the fiber, the witness, the timeline, the unanswered questions. Each detail sounded stronger when presented separately. Together, they created an image of guilt. Marcus challenged every weakness he could find. But uncertainty is difficult to defend against when 12 strangers are being shown a carefully edited version of events. Daniel watched the jury. One by one, their expressions hardened. He could feel the case slipping away before the verdict was ever read. Then Sarah Mitchell took the stand. Under oath, she was asked whether she remembered the man she had seen near the house. The photograph was raised. Her eyes moved from it to Daniel. There was hesitation. Then came the words that changed everything. "Yes." The prosecutor asked whether she was certain. "Yes." Across the room, Daniel looked at her. He had never seen her before. Yet one uncertain memory had just become certainty in front of 12 jurors. Cole stood to challenge the identification. But the damage was already done. A frightened witness had become the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence. The verdict took less than a minute. Guilty. The words seemed to hang in the room after everyone else had stopped moving. His mother broke down behind him. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. Daniel didn't react. He simply stared ahead. The judge imposed the sentence. 18 years. By the time the courtroom emptied, the story had already been decided. A young man had entered a house. A man had died. Evidence had connected them. A jury had believed it. And the person at the center of it all had been condemned to a prison sentence for a crime he had never committed. But the most devastating part was still ahead. Because somewhere outside that courtroom, the people who knew the truth were still free. Prison did not begin with despair. It began with disbelief. The first night was spent convincing himself that someone would discover the mistake. The appeal would come. The evidence would be reviewed. A witness would correct the record. Somebody would notice. He kept his mother's photograph beside him and repeated the same thought until sleep finally arrived. This cannot be my life. He was still young enough to believe that truth automatically defeated lies. Prison would teach him otherwise. His mother came every visiting day she could afford. She brought letters, photographs, food he couldn't eat through the glass, and stories about the neighborhood. She never asked whether he was innocent. She already knew. What she couldn't promise was how long she would be able to keep fighting. Outside the prison, she challenged anyone who would listen. Inside, her son learned to measure time differently. Not by months, by visits, by birthdays missed, by letters that became shorter, and eventually, by the number of chairs left empty across the glass. The first appeal failed. So did the second. By then, Daniel had stopped waiting for someone else to rescue him. He began studying the case himself. Old reports were requested. Court transcripts were copied by hand. Every date, every statement, every piece of evidence was placed beside the others. A fellow prisoner named Harold Bennett showed him how to search legal decisions and identify contradictions. The work was slow, but eventually a pattern emerged. Several important pieces of evidence had passed through the same police department, and almost every disputed detail could be traced back to one person: Detective Robert Kane. While Daniel studied prison law, Robert Kane's career moved in the opposite direction. The detective who had led the murder investigation was promoted, then promoted again. His handling of the Reed case was praised as decisive police work. Awards followed. Photographs appeared in newspapers. Colleagues described him as thorough. Nobody mentioned the contradictions buried inside the original investigation. Nobody mentioned the missing evidence. And nobody asked why a case that looked so perfect on paper had required so many explanations. The man who helped put Daniel behind bars was being rewarded for doing it. One letter never reached him. It came from a man Daniel didn't know. The writer claimed to have information about the night Michael Reed died. The envelope was intercepted before it reached the cell. Daniel never saw it. He never knew it existed. The letter was eventually filed away, with dozens of other documents nobody considered important. Years later, its contents would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against the people who had built the original case. But for now, it remained exactly where someone wanted it. Hidden. Years passed without permission. His mother grew older. The woman who had once arrived carrying food and arguments about his haircut now needed help walking into the visitation room. She still told him the same thing. Don't let them change who you are. He promised. It was the last full conversation they would ever have. A few months later, she died. Daniel was denied permission to attend the funeral. For the first time since his conviction, he stopped writing appeals. Not because he believed the case was hopeless. Because the person he had been fighting to return to was gone. After his mother's death, something changed. The anger became quieter. The desperation disappeared. What remained was discipline. He exercised every morning. He read law every afternoon. At night he wrote, not because he expected sympathy, because he had finally understood that the case would not collapse on its own. He had to find the crack himself. And 18 years after his arrest, he knew the original investigation better than the people who had conducted it. There was only one problem. The one person who could explain the missing pieces had disappeared. Robert Kane had retired years earlier. His name was no longer appearing in newspapers. The medals were packed away. The old case files should have been forgotten. But some memories refused to stay buried. On rainy evenings, he sometimes opened a metal box he had kept since leaving the department. Inside were documents that had never entered the official case file. Photographs, notes, a recording, and one page that could destroy everything. He had told himself he kept them as insurance. The truth was simpler. He had been afraid that one day someone would come looking. The crack appeared in an old transcript. Daniel had requested the document years earlier. Nobody had noticed what was buried inside it. A witness statement contained a detail that contradicted the official timeline by almost 3 hours. More importantly, the witness had described seeing Michael Reed alive after the prosecution's stated time of death. Daniel read the passage once. Then again. His hands began to shake. If the statement was genuine, the official timeline was impossible. And if the timeline was impossible, The conviction could not stand on the evidence presented. He immediately requested the original witness file. What came back was worse. The witness statement had vanished. Daniel needed someone outside the prison. That was when Lena Brooks entered the story. She was an investigative journalist who had spent years examining questionable convictions. He gave her the transcript. She read the passage. Then she stopped. "Where is the original? That's what I need you to find." She promised nothing. She simply took the copy and left. 3 days later, she called back. Her voice was different. She had found the witness. The person whose statement had disappeared from the official file was still alive. And she was ready to talk. For the first time in 18 years, Daniel wasn't fighting alone. But the woman waiting to tell the truth had no idea that someone had already tried to silence her once. Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 years trying not to remember that night. When Lena finally found her, she was living under a different surname in a town several hours away. She didn't deny knowing about the case. She simply asked one question. "Does Daniel still believe I lied?" Lena told her the truth. He believed she had been mistaken. Sarah lowered her eyes. "I wasn't mistaken." She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was the statement she had given police the morning after Michael Reed's death. It contained one detail she had never mentioned in court. She had seen Michael alive, and she had seen him with someone else. The statement changed the entire timeline. Sarah had not seen Daniel enter the house. She had seen him arrive later. Before that, Michael Reed had walked out of his own house alive. And he had not been alone. Thomas Vale had been with him. Sarah remembered the two men arguing beside the road. She remembered Michael looking frightened. Then she saw Daniel's car approaching from the opposite direction. The two events had been separated by enough time to destroy the prosecution's original sequence. But Sarah had been frightened. When police questioned her again, the detective told her that memories become unreliable under stress. Then he showed her Daniel's photograph. After that, she stopped correcting them. The original statement was longer. Much longer. Several paragraphs had disappeared before the document reached the prosecution. The missing section contained Sarah's description of Michael leaving the house alive. It also mentioned Thomas Vale. Lena compared the original with the official report line by line. The omission wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately removed the part that destroyed the timeline. And that raised a much larger question. Who had access to the statement before it became evidence? The answer was sitting at the bottom of the page. A handwritten notation. Robert Kane's initials. The first threat arrived before midnight. Lena's phone rang from an unknown number. She answered. Nobody spoke. Then a man's voice said 4 words. "Leave the old case alone." The call ended. She stood motionless for several seconds. Then she looked at the documents covering her table. Fear would have been understandable. Instead, she reached for her recorder. She documented the call. Then she made a second call. This one was to the prison. Daniel answered. She told him someone knew what she had found. His response was immediate. "Then you found the right thing." That same night, Robert Kane opened the box he had avoided for 18 years. He removed the old recorder. The tape had been made during the investigation. It was never submitted as evidence. He had kept it because destroying it would have meant destroying the last proof of what really happened. Kane pressed play. A younger version of his own voice filled the basement. Then another voice answered. A voice he recognized immediately. Thomas Vale. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. but it explained why Daniel had been chosen and why Michael Reed had disappeared. Daniel had not been chosen because he was connected to the murder. He had been chosen because he wasn't. He had no powerful relatives, no expensive attorney waiting for him, no reason to suspect that anyone would fight very hard if the police accused him. Most importantly, his presence at the house could be explained. He had arrived after Michael disappeared from the scene. That made him perfect. Thomas needed someone to carry the blame. Kane needed a case that could be solved quickly. And Daniel happened to be standing exactly where their story needed him. Michael Reed hadn't been murdered. He had been forced to disappear. The night Sarah saw him alive, he was already preparing to leave. Thomas had discovered that Michael possessed information capable of destroying a powerful criminal operation. Michael was frightened. He agreed to disappear because he believed it was the only way to stay alive. But one problem remained. Someone needed to die in his place. A body was found. The identity was never publicly questioned. And Daniel Cross was positioned close enough to the scene to become the perfect answer. The body was the centerpiece of everything that followed. A dead stranger became Michael Reed. No family member was brought in to make the identification. No independent expert was asked to challenge it. The paperwork simply carried the name investigators needed. By the time the body entered the official record, the identity had become a fact. And once that fact was accepted, every other part of the case could be arranged around it. Daniel's conviction depended on one assumption. Michael Reed was dead. For 18 years, nobody had seriously questioned it. Michael Reed had spent 18 years living under another name. He watched the world from a distance. He built no lasting friendships. He avoided hospitals. He avoided police. He avoided the places where photographs were taken. Every birthday reminded him of the same decision. He had survived. Someone else had paid the price. Then one morning, a journalist found him. She didn't ask whether he was alive. She already knew. She asked whether he was ready to tell the truth. For 18 years, he had been afraid of that question. Now he finally had an answer. There was only one way to undo 18 years of silence. Walk into the courtroom. Michael knew exactly what would happen when people saw him. The case would collapse. Daniel would be vindicated. And everyone who had helped bury the truth would become vulnerable. But the hardest part wasn't facing the police. It wasn't facing the prosecutors. It was facing the man who had spent 18 years paying for his survival. He packed one bag, took the old evidence with him, and left the house. Across the country, Daniel was still waiting behind prison walls. He had no idea that the dead man was already on his way back. And when those courtroom doors finally opened, 18 years of lies would begin collapsing in a matter of seconds. Michael arrived before the courthouse became crowded. He stood outside for several seconds without moving. 18 years earlier, he had disappeared from this world. Now he was about to walk back into it. Lena stood beside him. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to rehearse. The truth was simple. A man had been convicted of murdering Michael Reed. Michael Reed was alive. All that remained was proving it. Marcus Cole had spent 18 years studying the face in an old photograph. He had seen it thousands of times. He knew the jawline, the eyes, the shape of the mouth. Still, seeing Michael Reed standing in his office felt impossible. The attorney slowly rose from his chair. Michael said nothing. He simply placed the old photograph on the desk. Then he placed his identification beside it. Marcus looked from one to the other. His voice dropped. "Where have you been?" Michael answered quietly. "Trying to stay alive." Nobody was prepared to simply take his word for it. The verification process began immediately. Photographs were compared. Fingerprints were checked. Old records were retrieved. Birth records were examined. Every test produced the same result. The man standing in that room was Michael Reed. Not someone who resembled him. Not an imposter. The victim named in Daniel's murder conviction was alive. Marcus stared at the results. Then he asked the question nobody wanted to answer. If he's alive, whose body did Daniel go to prison for? The news reached the prosecutor's office before noon. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the questions began. Who had verified him? Who had contacted the police? Who knew about the original body? Who had known Michael was alive? Evelyn Grant ordered the file brought back out. The same case she had once considered airtight now sat open beneath her hands. The photograph of Michael Reed was still inside. So was Daniel's conviction. 2 documents. 2 realities. Only one could survive. The original case file was retrieved from storage. Marcus went through it piece by piece. The paperwork looked familiar. But now that Michael was alive, every assumption had to be questioned. The body identification. The laboratory report. The witness statement. The timeline. Then he found something that had been overlooked for 18 years. The body recovered that night had never been positively identified through DNA. The name Michael Reed had been written on the paperwork, but the science behind the name wasn't there. The old body had to be tested again. Dr. Alina Brooks was brought back into the investigation. This time, there was no pressure to support a prosecution. Only one question mattered. Who was the dead man? The DNA comparison took hours. When the result arrived, the room went silent. The remains were not Michael Reed. They belonged to another man. A man whose identity had been buried so thoroughly that even his family had never been told what happened to him. Daniel hadn't been convicted of killing Michael. He had been convicted on the assumption that a different man's body was Michael's. The news reached Daniel through a sheet of paper. Michael Reed was alive. Daniel read the sentence several times. Then he looked at Marcus. "You're telling me the man they said I killed is alive?" Marcus nodded. Daniel sat back down. For 18 years, he had imagined the moment someone finally admitted the truth. He had imagined anger. He had imagined shouting. Instead, he felt something stranger. Relief. Not because 18 years could be returned. They couldn't. But because, at last, the world had been forced to confront the question he had been asking since the beginning. If Michael is alive, why am I still here? The emergency petition was filed before the day ended. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. The supposed victim was alive. The body was someone else. The original identification had failed. And the witness had admitted that her testimony had been manipulated. Judge Alina Hayes reviewed the material herself. Then she issued an order. Daniel Cross was to be brought back to court immediately. The conviction could no longer be treated as reliable. But there was one complication. The state still hadn't explained who had arranged the original deception. By the next morning, the courthouse was surrounded. News crews arrived before sunrise. Police increased security. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who appeared near the entrance. But the biggest story wasn't Daniel's conviction. It was the man walking into the building. Michael Reed had returned from the dead. And for the first time in 18 years, his face would appear in the same courtroom where his name had condemned another man. Inside, Daniel was being transported under heavy security. He still didn't know exactly what awaited him. Then the courtroom doors opened. Daniel heard the courtroom doors open behind him. Every head turned. He remained still. Then Marcus looked toward the entrance. His expression changed. Daniel noticed. "What is it?" Marcus didn't answer. The room fell strangely quiet. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Slow. Measured. Getting closer. Daniel turned. A man stepped through the doorway. Gray touched his hair now. His face was older, but the eyes were unmistakable. Daniel stared at him. The judge stopped speaking. The prosecutor stood. Someone in the gallery whispered the words that would soon be heard around the world. "That's Michael Reed." The man Daniel had supposedly murdered was standing alive in the courtroom. For several seconds, nobody moved. The courtroom had been prepared for an appeal. It had not been prepared for a resurrection. Daniel stared at the man standing by the doors. He searched the older face for something familiar. Then Michael spoke. "Daniel." That single word broke the silence. 18 years of certainty collapsed into one impossible moment. The judge ordered everyone to remain seated. Nobody listened immediately. The gallery erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. And Daniel simply stood there, staring at the man whose supposed death had stolen nearly 2 decades of his life. Daniel walked toward him. Not quickly, not angrily, just enough to make sure this was real. Michael lowered his eyes. "I should have come back sooner." Daniel's jaw tightened. 18 years sooner. Michael had no defense. He admitted that fear had controlled him. He had believed disappearing would keep him alive. He hadn't understood what his silence would cost someone else. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then came the question nobody in that courtroom wanted to hear. "Why didn't you tell them?" Michael finally looked up. Because the people who killed the truth were still watching. Then the court learned the identity of the actual dead man. His name was Thomas Miller. He had never been Michael Reed. His family had spent 18 years believing he had simply disappeared. Now they were being told that the body buried under another man's name had belonged to their son. The judge ordered the forensic evidence entered into the record. There was no ambiguity. DNA doesn't care about theories. It doesn't care about police reputations. And it doesn't care what a jury was told 18 years earlier. The body had never been Michael, which meant the murder prosecution had been built on a false identity from the beginning. Marcus then introduced the evidence that had survived 18 years in silence. The recording. The courtroom listened. Robert Kane's younger voice could be heard discussing Daniel's arrest. Then Thomas Vale's voice followed. The conversation revealed that Daniel had been selected before the investigation was complete. There was no misunderstanding, no innocent explanation. They had needed a suspect. They had needed the public to believe the case was solved. And Daniel had been convenient. When the recording ended, nobody in the courtroom spoke. The evidence didn't merely challenge the conviction. It explained it. Robert Kane was brought into court. The detective who had once watched Daniel disappear behind a prison door now had to face him across the same room. Under oath, he initially denied everything. Then Marcus played the recording. Kane closed his eyes. The denial ended. He admitted the investigation had been manipulated. He admitted the witness statement had been altered. He admitted the body had never been properly identified. And finally, he admitted the reason Daniel had been selected. He was the easiest person to make the story fit. Daniel didn't look away. After 18 years, he finally heard the truth from the man who had taken his freedom. The recording led investigators to Thomas Vale. For 18 years, he had lived under the assumption that the case was buried permanently. It wasn't. The evidence connected him to Michael's disappearance, then to the manipulation of the investigation, then to the people who had helped conceal the truth. When investigators finally approached him, there was nowhere left to run. The arrest happened outside his office. Cameras captured the moment. The man who had once believed Daniel would disappear quietly into prison was now being taken away in handcuffs. The story had finally reversed direction. The judge didn't soften the ruling. Daniel Cross's conviction was vacated. His guilty verdict was overturned. The murder charge was dismissed. The record that had followed him for 18 years was finally declared what it had always been. Wrong. Daniel stood completely still. There was no celebration. No smile. Not yet. He had spent too many years imagining this moment to understand it immediately. The judge looked directly at him. "You are free to go." 4 words. 4 words that should never have taken 18 years to hear. When Daniel walked outside, the cameras were waiting. He wasn't. He stopped halfway down the courthouse steps. For 18 years, he had imagined freedom as something dramatic. Instead, it felt strangely ordinary. Cars passed. People talked. A bus stopped at the corner. Nobody knew that the man standing there had just recovered 18 stolen years. He looked at the city, then at the small box containing everything the prison was giving back. A watch, some old photographs, a few letters. His entire lost life reduced to one cardboard box. His first free morning began with coffee. No guards. No count. No locked door waiting behind him. He walked until his legs became tired simply because he could. The world had continued without asking permission. Buildings had changed. People had aged. Technology had moved forward. Even the sound of traffic felt unfamiliar. He stood beside the water and realized something painful. Freedom wasn't the end of what had happened to him. It was the beginning of learning how to live after it. There was one person he couldn't thank. His mother had died believing her son would eventually come home. She never got to see it. Daniel returned to the house where she had once waited for him. The kitchen was smaller than he remembered. The chair where she used to sit was still there. He placed her photograph on the table. Then he sat down. For the first time, there was nobody to convince. Nobody to persuade. Nobody to prove anything to. He had finally come home. But the question that remained would follow him for the rest of his life. How do you rebuild a life after someone else has stolen 18 years of it? There was one more family he needed to face. Thomas Miller's. The man whose body had been mistaken for Michael Reed had a family of his own. They had spent 18 years believing they would never know what happened to him. Daniel didn't know what to say. So he didn't try to explain the unexplainable. He simply apologized for the years their family had lost too. Thomas's mother looked at him for a long time. Then she said something Daniel never expected. "You were a victim too." For the first time, he understood that the truth hadn't created just one tragedy. It had revealed several. Daniel eventually sat across from Michael. There was no courtroom this time. No lawyers. No cameras. Just 2 men sitting across from each other. Michael apologized. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew better. Daniel listened. Then he told him something Michael would never forget. "I understand why you were afraid." A pause. "But you don't get to call 18 years a mistake." Michael lowered his eyes. Daniel wasn't interested in revenge. He had already lost enough of his life to someone else's choices. What he wanted now was something neither of them could recover. The truth. Daniel never became bitter. At least not permanently. Instead, he built something from what remained. He began helping prisoners challenge convictions that didn't make sense. He taught them how to read their own case files, how to question timelines, how to recognize missing evidence, how to keep fighting when everyone outside had already moved on. He couldn't recover his 18 years, but he could make sure another person didn't lose 18 of theirs. His prison cell had once been the place where his story nearly ended. Now the lessons learned inside it were helping other people find the door. There was one object Daniel kept from prison. An old watch. It had stopped working years earlier. He kept it anyway. Not because it reminded him of prison. Because it reminded him that time can stop for one person while the rest of the world keeps moving. 18 years had disappeared from his life. No judge could return them. No apology could restore them. No settlement could make him 24 again. But the clock was still capable of moving forward. So was he. For 18 years, the world called Daniel Cross a murderer. They put his name on a case file. They put his face on the news. They put his body behind concrete and steel. And they convinced themselves the story was finished. But the truth had never died. It had simply been buried. And eventually, it walked into the courtroom on its own 2 feet. Daniel couldn't get his 18 years back. But he could decide what happened to the years that remained. He stepped away from the courthouse. And for the first time in 18 years, nobody was waiting to lock the door behind him. The strange thing about freedom was that it did not feel particularly dramatic the morning after Daniel received it. There was no celebration waiting for him when he opened his eyes. No courtroom applause. No sudden feeling that the 18 missing years had somehow been returned. There was only a quiet room and the uncomfortable realization that nobody was going to tell him what happened next. For nearly 2 decades, every part of his day had been decided by somebody else. When he woke, when he ate, when he walked outside, when he returned to his cell, even the smallest choices had belonged to an institution. Now, Daniel could simply get out of bed. That freedom should have felt enormous. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. He reached for the phone sitting beside him and stared at the screen for several seconds. Technology had changed while he was away. People communicated differently. The world moved faster. Even ordinary objects seemed to assume that he already knew how they worked. Daniel had spent 18 years trying to convince the world that he was not a murderer. Nobody had prepared him for the much harder question that came afterward. What does a man do when the world finally gives him his life back? The first lesson was that freedom had a learning curve. Daniel discovered this in places most people never thought about. A coffee shop, for example. He stood in front of a menu filled with options that seemed unnecessarily complicated, watching people order with a few movements of their fingers. Someone tapped a phone. A machine beeped. A payment appeared to happen without cash changing hands. Daniel eventually sat down with his coffee and watched the room. It was almost funny. For 18 years, people had assumed he was incapable of being trusted with the simplest things, because a jury had decided he was capable of murder. Now he was sitting in a room full of strangers who knew nothing about him. And that anonymity gave him something unexpected. Peace. Nobody was looking at him because of the headline. Nobody knew the photograph that had once appeared beside his name. Nobody cared about the prosecution's theory. To them, he was simply another man drinking coffee. Daniel realized that this might have been one of the first truly ordinary moments he had experienced in nearly 2 decades. There was no officer watching him. No locked door. No schedule. Just coffee cooling on a table and an entire world moving around him. It was ordinary. And to Daniel, ordinary had become extraordinary. The city was another kind of shock. Daniel remembered streets that no longer looked the way they did in his memories. Stores had disappeared. Buildings had been demolished. Businesses had changed names. Places he remembered as landmarks had become ordinary pieces of a city that had continued developing without him. At first, he tried to reconstruct the past. He would stand on a corner and remember what used to be there. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he wasn't. Memory had preserved the world in a particular shape, but reality had never agreed to remain still. That realization followed him everywhere. Daniel had spent 18 years waiting for the moment when he could return. But nobody had told him that returning did not mean returning to the same place. The world he had fought to get back to was gone. His old life was gone. His mother's voice was gone. The version of himself who had entered prison at 24 was gone too. What remained was a man standing in the middle of a city that had moved forward without him. For the first time, Daniel understood that being released was not the same thing as being restored. Freedom could open the door. It could not rebuild what had disappeared behind it. Then came the visit Daniel had been avoiding. His mother's house. He had imagined returning there countless times while he was incarcerated. In those imagined versions, she was always waiting. Sometimes she opened the door before he knocked. Sometimes she simply sat at the kitchen table and smiled when he walked inside. Reality was less merciful. The house was still there. The chair was still there. The kitchen still carried small traces of the woman who had spent years believing that her son would eventually come home. But she was not there to see him. Daniel stood quietly in that kitchen and looked at her photograph. There are losses that a courtroom cannot compensate for. A judge can overturn a conviction. A prosecutor can apologize. A government can issue a settlement. None of them can give a mother back the years she spent waiting. None can recreate the conversations that never happened. None can restore the birthdays missed because someone had decided that an innocent man belonged behind bars. Daniel had spent 18 years proving that he deserved freedom. Standing in that kitchen, he understood that freedom had arrived carrying its own grief. He had won the case, but there were people he had lost before he could ever receive the victory. The prison followed Daniel home in ways nobody could see. Some nights he woke suddenly because he thought he heard keys turning in a lock. Other nights, footsteps in the hallway were enough to make his body tense before his mind understood that he was safe. The habits had been built over 18 years. They could not disappear because a judge had finally declared him free. There were nights when Daniel woke before dawn and simply sat on the edge of the bed. He would listen. No voices. No metal doors. No orders. Nothing. And somehow, the silence could feel louder than the prison itself. One morning, he noticed the time. 3:17. His eyes moved to the old watch sitting on the table. The watch had stopped years ago. Daniel picked it up. He turned it over in his hand and thought about everything that had happened since it stopped. The trial. The prison. The appeals. The years. The courtroom. Michael walking through those doors. Then he looked at the working clock. 3:18. The world was still moving. And perhaps that was the most difficult lesson of all. Daniel could not make the lost time start again. He could only decide what to do with whatever remained. The first letter arrived months later. Daniel almost ignored it. He had begun receiving messages from people who wanted to know about his case, people who wanted interviews, people who wanted to understand what had happened. This letter was different. It came from a prisoner Daniel had never met. The man believed his conviction contained serious mistakes. A witness statement had changed. A timeline appeared inconsistent. And an important piece of evidence seemed to have vanished between one stage of the investigation and another. Daniel read the letter once. Then again. Something about the man's questions felt painfully familiar. Not because the two cases were identical. They weren't. But Daniel recognized the language of someone who had discovered that the official version of his life did not match the evidence in front of him. He knew that feeling. He had lived inside it for 18 years. So Daniel sat down and began writing. He did not promise the man freedom. He did not pretend to be a lawyer. He simply told him what Daniel himself had learned the hardest way possible. Do not stop asking questions. Do not assume a document is correct simply because it is official. And never allow someone else's certainty to replace your own examination of the facts. Daniel mailed the letter. He had no idea that it would become the beginning of his second life. Daniel discovered that he had become good at something he never wanted to learn. Finding inconsistencies. He knew what a suspicious timeline looked like. He knew how easily one missing document could change the meaning of an entire case. He knew that evidence did not always announce itself as important. Sometimes it was a date written in the corner of a page. Sometimes it was a statement that changed by 3 words. Sometimes it was the absence of a report that should have existed. Daniel began helping people examine their cases one document at a time. He was careful. He refused to promise outcomes. He refused to tell anyone that innocence automatically guaranteed justice. His own experience had taught him otherwise. Instead, he asked questions. Who collected this? When? Who handled it afterward? Why does this date contradict that report? Why did this witness disappear from the record? Why was this evidence mentioned once and never again? The questions were simple. The answers were often complicated. But Daniel had learned something during his own fight. A system could become very confident in the wrong answer. Sometimes, all it needed was one person willing to ask why. Eventually, Daniel sat across from another prisoner who reminded him of the man he had once been. The man's name was Marcus Hill. He had been incarcerated for years and maintained that his conviction contained serious errors. Daniel listened while Marcus explained his case. There was no dramatic confession, no secret recording, no convenient piece of evidence waiting to save him. There was simply a file, pages and pages of it. Daniel opened the folder and began reading. They went through the timeline slowly. A statement here, a report there, a discrepancy that seemed insignificant until it was placed beside another. Daniel stopped. He asked Marcus about a particular date. Marcus didn't know. Daniel asked whether anyone had ever questioned it. Marcus shook his head. That moment reminded Daniel why he had started doing this. Wrongful convictions did not always survive because someone had created an elaborate conspiracy. Sometimes they survived because everyone involved had stopped asking questions. Daniel knew what happened when that occurred. One unanswered question could become 1 year. 1 year could become 5. 5 could become 18. He looked at Marcus through the glass. Then he returned to the file and kept reading. Daniel eventually realized that he had been given something he never expected to possess again. Purpose. For 18 years, his entire existence had revolved around one question. How do I prove that I am innocent? Now that question had been answered. The harder question was what he would do with the person he had become while searching for that answer. He could have disappeared. He could have walked away from courtrooms forever. He could have spent the rest of his life talking about what had been taken from him. Instead, he began speaking to others. Students, families, people who had watched someone they loved disappear into the justice system. People who believed that something was wrong, but had no idea where to begin looking. Daniel never told them that the system was always corrupt. That would have been too simple. He told them something more uncomfortable. Systems were built from people. People made mistakes. People became tired. People made assumptions. And sometimes people became so convinced that they were right that they stopped looking for reasons they might be wrong. Daniel knew exactly what that could cost. He had paid for it with 18 years. Daniel still kept the watch. He could have thrown it away. He could have buried it in a drawer and never looked at it again. Instead, he carried it. Not because he wanted to remember prison. Because he wanted to remember what time meant. For 18 years, time had been something happening to him. Years disappeared while he waited. Birthdays passed. Seasons changed. People grew older. Some people died. The world continued moving while Daniel remained in the same place, waiting for someone to recognize what had been done to him. Now time belonged to him again. That did not erase what happened. It did not make 18 years acceptable. It did not bring his mother back. It did not restore the life he would have lived if the original investigation had been honest. But it gave Daniel something that had once seemed impossible. A choice. He could spend the remaining years measuring everything he had lost. Or he could use them. So he carried the old watch as a reminder of the years that could never return. And he wore the new one as a reminder that there were still hours ahead. The world had taken 18 years from Daniel Cross. It could never give them back. But it had finally given him the right to decide what happened to the rest. And perhaps, after everything, that was the closest thing to justice he was ever going to receive. The first thing Daniel learned after his release was that freedom could not erase the knowledge he had gained inside prison. If anything, it made that knowledge harder to ignore. He had spent 18 years studying the machinery that had taken his life apart. He understood how a timeline could be made to look convincing. He understood how uncertainty could disappear from a report before it reached a jury. He understood how one person's assumption could become another person's evidence, until eventually an entire courtroom was staring at a conclusion nobody had properly tested. So when people began sending him case files, Daniel read them. Not because he believed every prisoner was innocent. He didn't. That distinction mattered deeply to him. What Daniel believed was that every serious claim deserved to be examined honestly. That was different. He looked for contradictions. He compared dates. He checked what had been said in the original investigation against what appeared in the final record. And sometimes there was nothing. A conviction that survived examination was still a conviction. But sometimes there was something. A missing report. A changed statement. A timeline that could not possibly work. And whenever Daniel found one of those things, he remembered the younger man who had once sat behind prison glass insisting that the truth was somewhere inside a stack of papers. He had been right. It had simply taken 18 years for someone to read them carefully enough. There was another family that had waited 18 years for the truth. Thomas Miller's. His name had existed inside the case as almost an afterthought. A body, a name, a piece of evidence used to construct a story about another man. But Thomas had been a person. He had a mother. He had memories. He had people who loved him. And for 18 years, those people had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what had happened to him. When Daniel finally met Thomas's family, he found himself struggling for words. What could he possibly say? That their son had been used to build a false murder case. That his own wrongful imprisonment had depended partly on Thomas's identity being erased. That both families had suffered because people in positions of authority had decided that an inconvenient truth was less useful than a convenient story. There was no explanation capable of making any of that acceptable. So Daniel didn't give one. He simply listened. And when Thomas's mother finally looked at him and said, "You were a victim too," something inside him shifted. For years, Daniel had thought of his own suffering as the center of the story. Now he understood that injustice rarely creates only one victim. Sometimes its consequences spread outward for generations. Sometimes the truth does not end a tragedy. It reveals how many people were trapped inside it. Michael Reed was alive. That fact had changed everything. But survival did not make him innocent. The two men eventually sat across from each other, without lawyers between them. Michael had spent 18 years running from people who wanted him dead. Daniel had spent 18 years behind bars because Michael had stayed away. Both things could be true. That was what made the conversation so difficult. Michael apologized. Not once. Several times. But he never asked Daniel to forgive him. He understood that forgiveness was not something he could request like a favor. Daniel listened quietly. Then he asked the question that had been waiting 18 years for an answer. "Why didn't you come back?" Michael explained the fear. The threats. The belief that returning would get him killed. The certainty that if he stayed hidden, eventually someone would expose the truth. But years became decades. And the longer he stayed away, the harder returning became. Daniel understood fear. Perhaps more than Michael realized. But understanding did not erase consequence. "You don't get to call 18 years a mistake," Daniel told him. Michael lowered his eyes. There was no argument to make. Because Daniel wasn't talking about 18 years on a calendar. He was talking about 18 years of birthdays. 18 years of mornings. 18 years of his mother's life. 18 years that Michael had survived. And Daniel had not. That distinction would remain between them for the rest of their lives. The correction of Daniel's conviction was only the beginning. Because once the record changed, everything built upon the original verdict had to be examined again. Reports were reviewed. Evidence was questioned. Investigators looked back at decisions that had once seemed ordinary. Some people had retired. Some had moved away. Some insisted they had simply trusted the information they were given. But trust could no longer be used as an excuse for failing to verify. Daniel's name had spent 18 years inside official records beside the word guilty. Now that same record carried a different conclusion. Wrongfully convicted. It was only 2 words. But Daniel understood how much they weighed. A person can disappear inside paperwork. A life can be reduced to a case number. A family can become a footnote. And sometimes the only evidence that a terrible injustice ever happened is a correction made years after the people who caused it have moved on. Daniel stood inside the archive one afternoon and looked at the file that had once defined him. The pages were still there. The reports were still there. The accusations were still there. But the conclusion had changed. The paper had not forgotten what happened. It simply no longer had the final word. Daniel never believed his experience gave him every answer. What it gave him was a question he could not stop asking. What happens to the people who don't have someone willing to keep looking? That question became the center of his work. Families began contacting him. Some were angry. Some were exhausted. Some had already spent years fighting and no longer believed anyone would listen. Daniel understood that feeling. He also understood something else. Not every case could be overturned. Not every suspicion would lead to proof. Not every person who claimed innocence would be vindicated. That was why he refused to sell people hope he could not guarantee. Instead, he taught them how to examine the facts, how to preserve documents, how to build timelines, how to compare testimony, how to ask questions without assuming the answer. He wanted people to understand that justice was not simply about winning. It was about making sure the truth had been given a fair chance to exist. Daniel had once needed someone to do that for him. Now, whenever possible, he tried to become that person for someone else. One case affected Daniel more than the others. Not because it was identical to his. Because of how familiar it felt. The man had been convicted largely on a timeline. A series of events that, when written in a report, appeared to make perfect sense. But Daniel had learned not to trust a timeline simply because it looked clean on paper. He began checking the details, the distances, the timestamps, the witness statements, the sequence of events. And then he found something. A gap, small enough to be ignored, large enough to matter. Daniel sat back from the desk. For a moment, he was no longer looking at another man's case. He was looking at his own. The same feeling. The same certainty from people who believed the official version was already complete. The same dangerous assumption that because a story made sense, it must be true. Daniel continued reading until well after midnight. He knew what was at stake. It wasn't simply one prisoner. It was the possibility that someone else could spend years behind a locked door because nobody had bothered to question a convenient timeline. Daniel had once lost 18 years that way. He refused to watch it happen again without a fight. The letters kept coming. Some were written by prisoners themselves. Others came from mothers, wives, brothers and daughters who had spent years trying to understand why someone they loved remained behind bars. Daniel read as many as he could. He knew he could not answer everyone. But he also knew what it meant to send a letter into the world and wonder whether anyone would care enough to open it. That knowledge changed the way he read them. He could hear the fear between the sentences, the frustration, the desperation, sometimes even the anger, and occasionally something else. Hoping. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that promised everything would work out. The kind that simply said, maybe somebody will finally look. Daniel understood that hope. It was the same thing that had kept him writing appeals after everyone else had moved on. The same thing that had survived after his mother died. The same thing that had brought him back to the case again and again. He couldn't restore the time those people had lost. He couldn't promise that every conviction would be overturned. But he could make one promise. Their cases would not be ignored simply because they were difficult. Daniel sometimes returned to the prison. Not as an inmate, as a visitor. The first time he walked through those corridors after his release, something unexpected happened. The walls looked smaller. The doors looked heavier. The place that had once seemed endless now appeared almost strangely compact. He remembered the first night, the first appeal, the first visit from his mother, the day he learned she had died, the hours spent studying legal documents under weak light, the moments when he had nearly convinced himself that nobody outside cared anymore. All of it existed inside those walls, but it no longer controlled him. Daniel stopped outside the cell where he had spent so many years. The door was open. He stood there for several seconds. Then he walked away. He didn't need to prove anything to the building. He didn't need to hate it. He simply needed to leave it behind. Because the prison had once been the place where Daniel's future seemed to disappear. Now it was only a place he had survived. Daniel eventually stopped asking what his life would have looked like if he had never been arrested. The question had no answer. Perhaps he would have married. Perhaps he would have had children. Perhaps he would have changed careers. Perhaps he would have remained exactly the same man he was at 24. There was no way to know. And Daniel realized that spending the rest of his life imagining a version of himself that no longer existed would be another way of losing time. So he stopped looking backward quite so often. He began making plans. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. He traveled. He worked. He helped people. He laughed more. Sometimes he still woke during the night. Sometimes a police siren could still make his body tense. Sometimes the anniversary of his arrest was difficult. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let the worst thing that ever happened to him become the only thing that ever happened to him. Daniel had been a prisoner. He had been a defendant. He had been a headline. He had been a number. But he was not those things anymore. He was simply a man walking forward. And after 18 years, forward was enough. There was a time when Daniel believed justice meant getting everything back. His freedom, his reputation, his mother's final years, the 18 birthdays, the ordinary mornings, the years that had disappeared behind a steel door. He eventually learned that justice could not do that. Nothing could. A court could overturn a conviction. A government could admit an error. A prosecutor could apologize. A guilty verdict could be erased from a record. But time did not reverse. The clock did not move backward. The young man who entered prison at 24 would never return. And perhaps that was the hardest truth Daniel had to accept. He had survived. But survival was not the same thing as restoration. So he kept the old watch. Not as a symbol of prison. Not as a reminder of the people who had betrayed him. As a reminder of something much simpler. Time is valuable precisely because it cannot be recovered. 18 years had been taken from him. He could not change that. But he could refuse to surrender the years that remained. That became Daniel's final answer to everything that had happened. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Not even forgiveness. Movement. Forward. One day at a time. The man who had once been told that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars now stood beside the water watching another day disappear into the horizon. The old watch remained still in his hand. The new one continued ticking. And Daniel finally understood the difference. One measured everything he had lost. The other measured everything he still had. He closed his fingers around the old watch. Then he turned away from the water and began walking. For 18 years, somebody else had decided where Daniel Cross could go. Now there was no one behind him. No locked door. No guard. No sentence. No cell. Only the road ahead. And this time, he was the one choosing where it led.
If these stories touch something inside you, don't just watch and leave. Subscribe to Mindfold Stories deserves to be heard.